All right, I'm actually going to get started. Doug Brown is having a couple internet problems today, so we've been off and online. So when he comes back online, I'll let him take over moderation. But this is Stacy Leidwinger from Goliath, and I am joined with Yemi Ladyju, also from Goliath, as our senior technical consultant. And today we really wanted to welcome you, especially those in the IGEL community, because we're going to talk about how ICA and HDX affects remote worker sessions. And we do hope that the famous Doug Brown, his internet comes back and he's able to join us here in a little bit. So just to level set, we are going to talk through at a high level a little bit about a background on Goliath. I promise it will be short. And then we're really going to jump in and start providing an overview of ICA HDX and then talk about how with Goliath, we can help take the complexity of understanding those metrics away so that you can effectively troubleshoot remote worker performance issues. As I said, as the voice said earlier, this will be recorded. So if you're looking for the recording, it'll be in your inbox in the next 24 hours. And then additionally, if you have questions, please submit them throughout the Q&A and we will get them either throughout the session or at the very end when we wrap up. So with that, let me jump into today's story. So I'm sure many of you here are struggling with the surge of remote workers. And frankly, having enough time to get everyone set up, make sure that you're troubleshooting issues and handling performance challenges that are coming in day to day. And this challenge is really compounded by the fact that even prior to the surge of remote working, you were really struggling in most cases and in most organizations to effectively do your job and have enough expertise to handle everything that was going on. And did you ever wonder why? Well, we broke down in terms of Citrix experts. One of the challenges that is really facing us around the globe is there simply isn't enough people to handle the demand for that expertise. So Citrix has around 400,000 customers. And then ideally, every organization, depending on size, has 2 or 3 admins that are supporting the infrastructure, assisting end users, monitoring, setting up test frameworks. So that means the demand for Citrix expertise is roughly 1.2 million. Now on the supply side, there's only 62 Citrix technical professionals out there around the globe, maybe another 50 to 100 CTAs. So even if on top of that, you add, let's say another 50,000 individuals with some sort of training or certification, the supply of experts is under 60,000. So when you look at that, no wonder many of you are strained to support your remote workforce, especially during times like this when you've had a great surge and increase. And then on top of it, I'm sure many of you as experts find that you are spending way too much time troubleshooting issues. Prior to the pandemic, whenever we talk with our clients, many of them would spend 25 to 30% of their time just troubleshooting basic issues. This means it was time taken away from optimizing performance, upgrading the infrastructure, building out monitoring capabilities. And so with that, now the extra demand has many of you really strained. And why does that strain exist? I probably don't need to tell you, but the complexity of Citrix is extreme. And in many cases, you have management asking, why couldn't you just get everyone up and running quickly? What kind of reports can we get? What is the end user experience? And they don't understand the complexity of answering and supporting this infrastructure because to them, Citrix is Citrix, one single application. But as many of you know, if delivering this end user experience isn't turning on one application or infrastructure component. In fact, it often requires over 15 different vendors or technical components to come together, work in concert, and be absolutely perfect in order to deliver that high-performing end-user experience. It means that you need all of the integrations and connections like Wi-Fi to work together. It means Doug Brown's Wi-Fi can't go out, 3 minutes before a webinar. It also means that you need to be able to support not only the top layer infrastructure of Citrix, all of the brokering services, all the applications that are being delivered through it, but also back-end systems like the licensing server, SQL database, profile servers, as well as the hypervisor layer. So when there is an issue, for example, slow logon performance, it's really hard to pinpoint. Is it slow logon because of an end user behavior element, like a slow Wi-Fi connection? Is it because there's a poor GPO setting within your Active Directory? Is it because the underlying hypervisor layer doesn't have enough resources? So when it comes to supporting and troubleshooting Citrix and responding to end user experience issues, it's really difficult because of this complexity. So now you're dealing with a lack of resources, a very complex infrastructure, and it's why the challenge is so high today in supporting your remote workforce. Now, this is really where Goliath comes in. Goliath has been offering monitoring and troubleshooting software around the end user experience for years, helping industries of all sizes anticipate, troubleshoot, and document the end user experience. When our customers hire us, they tell us it's almost as if they've hired a full-time troubleshooting expert that is available 24/7, 365 days a week, and never takes a lunch break. And the embedded intelligence and automation that is in the product truly allows this expert to not only handle and resolve issues quickly, but anticipate them before end users are even impacted. We can scale both technically and economically to support global organizations as well as small SMBs. And one thing I wanted to point out, and this has been really an opportunity to partner a lot with the Agile community, is our focus in healthcare. Beyond providing monitoring and troubleshooting across the Citrix infrastructure, we also can go ahead and provide that same visibility into all major EHR systems with our EHR modules for Epic, Allscripts, Meditech, and Cerner. So at the end of the day, what we are delivering is a single pane of glass that will provide visibility across that end user experience, your overall IT infrastructure, and Yemi, if you want to go to the next slide, this includes IGEL, as well as if you're in healthcare, the EHR applications. And that single pane of glass and visibility allows you to monitor, troubleshoot, alert, and report on every single element. So today, where we're really going to focus on is that end user experience and helping to quickly diagnose when one of your remote workers calls in and says they have poor session performance, slow log on. Is the root cause something within that complex infrastructure, or is it something to do with environmental factors or their own behavior that is impacting their experience? And when you're supporting remote workers who are not used to working remote, this becomes extremely challenging and extremely time consuming. And the only way to resolve these issues quickly is to have data, and data comes from ICA and HDX. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yemi, who's now going to dive deep into talking a little bit more about the ICA and HDX channels.
Thank you very much, Stacy. I think that's a good setup up till this point, which is okay, when you have remote users and you have users accessing your environment from number of different locations with multiple different elements that go into that. It is important that there's an understanding of the protocols that are being leveraged and some of the key functionality to be able to troubleshoot these issues. So in that context, let's take a look let's take a closer look at the ICA protocol itself. As we all know, it started off as a TCP layer 6 protocol designed by Citrix to be able to deliver a Unix-like experience for Windows. And that's, even on latent networks and things like that. So it's really designed for the purpose of, virtualization and giving you the ability to access these resources remotely. And because it's built for that, it has some features, some of them that I have listed here that really allow it to do so in a very good way. That's why Citrix has been very successful over the years. It has the virtual channels by breaking it up, right? It breaks down different bandwidth types, excuse me, that are being used inside of the session into different channels. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important in the next slide. It also is latency resilient. And the point of it being latency resilient is very useful, of course, because it delivers a better experience. However, leveraging some of the things that allow it to become latency resilient gives you the ability to drill in closer into the protocol from a troubleshooting perspective to be able to come up with answers. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we go through the metrics. Obviously, there's session reliability, HDX capabilities as well, adaptive transport, and a bunch of other features that are added on top of that base really the base functionality that the ICA protocol comes with. So moving forward to the ICA or to the virtual channels, I like to talk about this because understanding the virtual channels and the usage for an individual user session really allows you to get a closer look into the user's behavior. So because here in this diagram, it breaks down the different ICA channels. I think now it's no longer a primarily TCP protocol. It's mostly UDP with a TCP failover. But if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see all of the different virtual channels that that is a part of the ICA protocol. So when you're able to, and so when you have different channels for audio, for thin wire bandwidth, which is the Citrix display adapter, which means basically anything graphically intensive, for keyboard and mouse, for different USB traffic and things like that. And if you have the ability to visualize these channel usage for individual user sessions, this allows you to then see exactly what the user is doing, how each one of these channels or behaviors that the user is taking inside of his session is actually impacting his latency, his or her latency. And then you're able to pull all of that in together to be able to come up with answers as to, okay, what is causing a problem inside of a session? In my current configuration, is my environment able to support these users' activities, or do the users have to change their workflow or change the way they interact with the environment to be able to get a better session? And I like to show this slide as well because keep in mind that not just having the overall bandwidth, but having it in directional format gives you the ability to drill in further. So not only the input audio bandwidth, but input and output, right? Input and output scanner bandwidth or Twain bandwidth, multi media stream bandwidth. This really gives you that ability to say, okay, from which side are my issues coming from? And then with that, let's talk about the metrics. So with the ICA protocol being latency resilient, it really enables it to deliver a better experience even on bad networks. And how it's able to do that, how it's able to be latency resilient, is because of the measurements that it takes. So it's going to be measuring not only the round trip time, which we can see across this on top of the screen, where it measures the time that a user clicks on or interacts with the environment, the time it takes for it to traverse the network all the way to the app server. The app server then processes it and sends it back to the user. So if you look on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, that is the same exact user, just sort of drawing a straight line between the interaction and then reaction from the ICA session. So the ICA protocol is going to be measuring things like the network latency of that interaction. So this is going to adapt and find that network latency and figure out what it needs to do to cache, whether it's caching or any other actions. It's going to figure out autonomously what it needs to do to deliver a better session for this user. So because it's measuring this information, if you have access to that on the server side, you now have the ability to tell whether or not there is an issue inside of this user session. So obviously, if we're looking at this diagram, there's about three elements to this. There's a user element, which is the user and his connection at his location. There's a network element, which is the overall network and everything that goes into the network. And then there's a server side element. So for the ICA protocol, typically, inside of a session, network latency and the connection speed at the user's end are going to be the major contributing factors to the ICA round trip time. So getting information into that really allows you to identify any issues that come up. And that's why you need a tool that's able to integrate with the ICA protocol itself, collect these measurements that the ICA protocol is automatically doing on its own, and then leveraging these to be able to come up with answers, not only defining the user's connection speed, which we'll talk about in our user story, network latency as well, and even the ICA breakdown which really gives you all the information that's needed. So with that, I'll pass it over, or I think I don't think Doug has his audio back. So with that, I'll pass it over to Stacy, and she can talk a little bit about some of the user stories, or how customers have been able to leverage this to come up with answers and troubleshoot issues from a remote worker standpoint.
And Yemi, before I jump into the user story, there was one question that came in that I think would be appropriate to respond. The question was, for a lot of what you showed, is it different pulling data from receiver and getting this data if the session's being run on a full desktop or a thin client like iGel?
Oh, that's a good question. And I can flip back over to that slide and to talk about that, because the ICA protocol is going to be collecting all of this information regardless of if it's a full desktop OS or thin client or fat client, zero client. It doesn't matter, because the ICA protocol is still functioning the same way, which is measuring the connection speed at the user's endpoint, measuring the network latency, measuring the ICA latency and round trip time, and it's then trying to adapt and deliver a better experience to the user. So regardless of what kind of endpoint you have, that information is still going to be available in a purpose-built tool.
Great, thank you. And please keep the questions coming. We'll stop when it makes sense. So as Yemi said, before we dive into how you can get greater visibility into ICA HDX, we wanted to take a step back and talk through a case study which involves both iGel and Goliath. So Penn National Insurance, they were rolling out, and this was last fall, a virtual workspace initiative. They had an increase in a remote workforce, and they wanted to be able to support them effectively using their existing hardware. And this is really where iGel came into play as well. Now, what happened is they were starting to roll out iGel and started to receive some end user complaints around slow session performance. And all too often, that first technology or last technology in is the first one to get blamed. And so those that were watching the project said, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't be using the thin clients. It seemed like they're the ones causing the issues. Well, anyone that was looking at the infrastructure said there's no way that this is what's causing the issues, and in fact should have almost no impact on the end user performance. And so they called in Goliath so that we could drive visibility around why were end users experiencing poor session performance. And what they were able to do, and Yemi's going to show this, is by having visibility into the ICA and HDX channels, they were quickly able to pinpoint that they were having connection speed drops. They were having poor bandwidth allocation in their home offices. And so it really was not a global issue where everyone was having issues. There was a handful of end users, and most of the reasons that they were having those issues was because of behavior and impact with how they were using their home Wi-Fi networks and how many people were on at a single time. But unless they had visibility into the data that showed them that this was the root cause, it would have continued to be a lot of finger pointing around why was there poor session performance? Why were their Cisco soft phones dropping? Was it to do with Citrix? Was it to do with their home Wi-Fi? Was it to do with the soft phone? Was it to do with iGel? And so much time can be spent finger pointing, but when you have hard data that really documents the end user experience and pinpoints root cause, you can quickly resolve and also share with management around what the issues are. And this is exactly what Penn National did. They were able to go live with their initiative, including iGel rollout, and over time, even reduce the amount of time that they use for troubleshooting overall end user experience issues. And so this use case is extremely critical as we think about now organizations having almost 100% of their workforce working remotely and trying to troubleshoot a lot of these issues. So with that, Yemi, I'll turn it over to you, and maybe you can start diving into exactly how Penn National Insurance was able to use the ICA and HDX channels to really identify where the issues were at.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in this scenario, and when they deploy their technology, they then flipped over to this portion of the technology here. This is the Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop Session Display. And this is where all of the sessions in the environment automatically populate. They had the ability to not only take a look at current sessions, but they can go back and see historic sessions. And this is We don't average or roll up any information we collect in our technology. So, sometimes users might not report an issue until, after the weekend or something like that. And you have the ability in the technology to go back and see, okay, for a session from a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, depending on how long you like to keep the data for, you can go back and see those sessions with the same amount of granularity as you would from a session from today or an active session. So that's what they typically would do. They would pull up their sessions here. They now have the ability to, depending on who's using the technology, they have the ability to personalize this by moving tabs around. They could sort or filter by any one of these sort of tabs that are here in the screen. So being able to find the sessions they're looking for. In this case, they can say, oh, I want to see, and use this quick search filter here at the top right. They wanted to see, let's say, all of their iGel Thin client sessions. They can see them here. And quickly sort of identify the sessions that they're looking for and drill in. So in my case, what I'm going to do here in this environment or this example is I'm going to filter here based off of, or sort based on ICA latency. So I found the top sessions with latency. I can then click on those sessions to be able to troubleshoot. Specifically, I want to understand what's actually driving that high latency for these sessions. So once I click on that session, I get a pop-up of about, in this case, about 7 tabs, giving me all the information I need to troubleshoot. However, I get the ability to troubleshoot the connection right away in this summary tab. So the summary tab pulls in key information about the session. First of all, here at the top of the screen, all of the components that contribute to that contributed to this user session. I can see a high-level breakdown of the logon process in the next section. And here in the key performance metrics section, this is typically where the folks at Penn National were able to sort of identify what was causing the slowness, leveraging the embedded intelligence and the integration into the ICA protocol. So here, round trip time, which effectively tells us, is this user having a problem or not? What we can see is that we're starting to see some issues here at this particular time, about 12:30, as well as in this session here, you can see it's about at 1:15 as well. There's major issues inside of this user session. So we want to understand, remember, there's 3 components here. There's the user component, there's the network component, and the server component. We want to understand which part of that is actually causing the problem. We can then focus here on network latency. This is, again, the real-time network latency, not the ping-based or test package or point-in-time network latency metric. This is real-time for this user session, for the duration of this user session, the network impact of this user session. And again, this is being measured by the ICA protocol. So in this session here, what I can see is that for the time, at the times that this user was having latency in this session, about 12:30, and also at about 1:15, there were major network latency issues in their session. So what that tells me, just by looking at this session, is that there was some sort of impact on the network that actually caused the slowness, as opposed to something on the VM resources or the host resource side. So this is sort of quick observation that's able to rule out a vast majority of the environment as being the root cause of the problem, without even having to drill into some of the other tabs and get or additional information. So with that, you can then say, okay, it's something within the network. Now, is it between the client network and our network, or something within our network? How you can then find that answer is by looking here at connection speed. This is the amount of bandwidth available for Citrix receiver at the user's endpoint. So wherever this user is connecting in from, their home office, maybe they are connecting into from a Starbucks or something like that, you're able to tell how much bandwidth receiver on that user's endpoint has for a Citrix session. So whether that is an iGel Thin client machine with its version of Citrix receiver, or a full a Windows OS or a Mac, you're able to tell how much bandwidth they have. So in this particular case, you can see that at about 12:30, there is a major drop in connection speed. First of all, this session didn't really have great connection speed to start with, but when it drops down to 0.1 megabits per second connection speed, there's a problem. And also at about 3:15 as well, you can see that there was another drop in connection speed which really correlates to the spikes in network latency and eventually the spike in round trip time that this user was experiencing. So with this sort of information, this is the type of information that Penn National had to have a conversation with the end users and say, okay, you're having a problem. We can see that you're having a problem, but it is that problem, excuse me, is because of poor connectivity at your location. What's happening? Are people on the Wi-Fi, or you know, are you far away from your Wi-Fi router? Maybe you need to plug directly into the modem. But this information that is being gathered by the ICA protocol really gives, you know, gave Penn National the ability to come up or to have those productive conversations, and really saved their remote worker initiative from being sort of scrapped. The next tab that really dives into that first. So remember, this is the summary tab. And if we flip over here to the ICA HDX channel breakdown, this then gives you additional information. You can see the connection speed here on the right-hand side, the network latency, ICA latency, as well as round trip time is all charted on the same graph. And then we have the ICA HDX channel breakdown, which again, this is going to break down all of the different channels that are being leveraged inside of the user session. And we'll talk about why that's important in the next user story, but I wanted to show you, you know, exactly where you can find that within the technology. So, you know, I just went through just sort of an on-the-fly, you know, demonstration in this environment. Let's actually flip over and talk about and show you the screenshots that we got from Penn National when they were actually deploying, or when they were sort of troubleshooting these issues. So in their environment, they sort of went through the same workflow I did, where they, you know, isolated the sessions. They take a look at the you know, connection speed, round trip time, and things like that on the summary tab, and then drilling in here into the ICA performance. They were able to see, and similar to the example we showed in the demo, you can see a spike in network latency, ICA latency, and round trip time, and that really correlates to a drop in connection speed on the right-hand side of the screen. They were able to have a conversation with this end user who, and this was, I think, about a year ago or something like that. He had his kids come back home from school at the time. They got on the Xbox. They, you know, started using, you know, of course, a lot of bandwidth to stream. He also had his spouse come back home from work, and she got on the Netflix and things like that. And that's actually what was bottlenecking and killing the bandwidth at that location. And as soon as he was able to get them to get off the Wi-Fi, then their connection speed went back up and they had a better session. So this was sort of the information that they really needed, because you know, without this, they're sort of flying blind and finger pointing on who's actually causing or affecting the environment negatively. So with that, I'll pass it over to Stacy to set up the next user story.
Great, thank you, Yemi. So here's one, we know many of you that registered are in the healthcare space, but this could be relevant to others beyond just healthcare. We were working with a large Cerner hospital, and one of the challenges they had is that their USB peripheral devices were either having poor connection speed or not connecting at all. In fact, they were using a lot of handheld scanners, printers, other USB drives, and it was impacting negatively patient care. And one of the challenges was they were using Cerner, which is hosted in Citrix, but they were accessing it through their on-premise VMware Horizon infrastructure. And so we often call this the double hop scenario, where they were actually accessing it through VMware, going out to the hosted environment that was in Citrix, and then pulling out the Cerner application. So when there was problems with the devices, as you can imagine, I'm sure some of you have been in these scenarios, there was a lot of finger pointing in terms of what was the root cause. Was it the device itself? Was it Cerner? Was it the hosted environment of Cerner, which was Citrix? Was it VMware Horizon? And without any type of data or evidence of where was the issue, the organization was really struggling, and it was becoming to be such a sour experience and negatively impacting patient care that it bubbled up to management, and management said, you need to figure out what's going on. And so the way they did that was really start looking at the ICA and HDX channel breakdowns, because not only can it show things like Yemi did in terms of Wi-Fi and connection speed, but it also talks a lot about the input and output of these different devices. So Yemi, with that, do you want to go ahead and show exactly which metrics they were able to use to quickly rule out what was not the problem, which ended up being Cerner and Citrix, and this allowed them to quickly identify what was the problem. Because often in these scenarios, it's not only important to see exactly what the issue is, but it's also to rule out what the issue is not, and really allows you to collaborate with the right people, whether it be internal to your organization, other vendors, as well as have conversations with end users, as Yemi had talked about in the earlier case study. So with that, Yemi, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Stacy. So when they deployed the technology into the Citrix environment, which was supporting Cerner, right? So Cerner is as Stacy mentioned, a healthcare application that's delivered primarily via Citrix virtual apps. And so what they did was when they deployed the technology for the Citrix portion, they went back to the session display, similar to how we did in the first scenario, to try and troubleshoot and figure out, okay, for these user sessions that are having peripheral issues, let's figure out what's actually taking place. Is there bandwidth actually being used inside of these sessions or not? Excuse me. So they went over and they found the sessions that they were looking for. They clicked down on those sessions. And again, working through, they get the pop-up of all the information they need. And in this case, they went right over to the ICA HDX channel and took a look at, for those user sessions, what bandwidth types were actually being used in the session. So for those sessions that were having problems, and as I mentioned before, there's, this breaks down the input and output, USB bandwidth, smart card bandwidth, Twain bandwidth, which is the scanners that they were using as well as printing. So what they found was that whenever a user would initiate a scan inside of the Cerner application, there would be output bandwidth going from Cerner to the users or to the on-premises VDI, VMware Horizon VDI session. However, there would be no input going back into the Cerner session. What that meant to this team is that the drive redirection from the Cerner or Citrix perspective seemed to be working very well, because there is output bandwidth going out of the Cerner session. However, there was nothing going back in from the Horizon session, meaning that there had to be some sort of issue taking place on the Horizon environment. That sort of information is what really helped them drive a conversation with the on-premises team, because they were able to show, okay, for the sessions that USB does not have problems, we are able to see, information going back and forth. But these affected sessions, they do not have information going back in. So there has to be some sort of client drive issue from the Horizon perspective. This then caused them to, deploy our technology for VMware into the VMware Horizon environment, which we're able to prove, I document as well that was the case. So, with this technology, understanding the breakdown of the channels and understanding not only the breakdown of the channels, but the directions of the bandwidth that's being leveraged in the technology or within the session, really was pivotal in being able to identify where the problems were coming from. What they also used this to do was try to baseline, the environment as well from a network perspective. They wanted to understand, okay, how much bandwidth do we need for a regular session? How much bandwidth is used to be able to support this environment? And they were able to use this information to get a baseline of that, and then collaborate with the network team as well. So, this information, although it's typically a blind spot, this information has been very, very helpful with drilling into and finding exactly the information you need for not only troubleshooting issues, but baselining and understanding your environment as a whole. I wanted to point out that there is a lot of information here on the screen, or that we've gone over. A lot of information that typically isn't very available, right, in a lot of tools out there. So in our technology, we have embedded links to our knowledge base. And what this will do is on any one of these tabs that you're on, and there's a dedicated logon tab, server tab, so on and so forth, if they're on any one of these tabs, you can actually click here on this question mark icon, and it'll take you directly to our knowledge base where we could, where we break down each one of these tabs, and then we define each one of the metrics that are here, and then give you tips on how to use these tabs to troubleshoot issues as they come up in your environment. So you can see here the network latency metrics and round trip time, those are all defined here with tips on how to identify the root cause, so on and so forth. So, with the technology, you're getting access to all of this deep information, but also the ability to use them to troubleshoot.
Great. Thank you, Yemi. Very much appreciated. And as we wrap up here, please go ahead and submit any questions that you may have. We're going to be wrapping up here in a minute. Yemi, you want to pull up the slides again? So one thing we did want to highlight before we wrap up is not only is it critical to get this data in real time when it comes to ICA and HDX, but it's also critical that you can report on that overall experience. And it isn't just related to the individual metrics. What many in IT management are asking today, because they're being asked even from their management, is how can I report on the overall end user experience? Do I know if people are having a good experience working from home? Do they have the right infrastructure to support them? In addition, they're being asked for information about worker productivity. Now that they're home working, are they actually productive within their environment? Yemi, could you show a couple different reports that give not only that real-time view, but also a historical view so that organizations can identify trends over time, especially as they go back and forth between the surge in remote working and potentially as people move back into the office, what impact that has in performance as well as productivity?
Yeah, absolutely. And to Stacy's point, it's really important to document this sort of information. And so right now, what I'm displaying here is the ICA latency report that really breaks down the users for the particular time period. It breaks down, what their client machine name, so whether they're using a iGel thin client or a fat client or a company issued machine or something like that. Breaks down where they're coming in from, their latency metrics for their session as well. So this allows you to understand and get a baseline for individuals and also for the environment as a whole to figure out, okay, what is actually impacting the latency and what's actually impacting the performance in our environment? Is it network latency or is it resource issues and things like that? The next report that we have on that same track of user experience, this is a more holistic view of user experience, again breaking down the users for a particular time frame, what applications or desktops that they were using in that time frame. But here we have the additional log on duration metrics here, whether or not the session that they had was actually responsive or not responsive, and so whether or not they had a good experience or not, of course. And then you have your ICA latency as well as their connection speed on the right-hand side of the screen. So this really is more of a holistic view of user experience, taking into consideration log-on duration, as well as ICA latency and connection speed. I know this has been something that has been very, very heavily used, especially during this sort of remote user time period that we're in, because this really gives IT the ability to say, okay, we are supporting our users, or our users aren't or are having a good experience, or they are not, and this is what we need to do to remediate those sort of things. Then the next report is more for user productivity. What this report does is it's going to break down or give you the definitive answer as to whether or not users are actually leveraging or using the tools that are being published via Citrix. And this report's going to break down on the left-hand side the users for a particular time period. It's going to break down their IP address, their what infrastructure they use to connect into the environment, their session start date and end date, the overall duration of the session, how long they were actually interacting with the environment. So how long within their session or within their session duration are they creating ICA traffic by interacting with the environment. Conversely, you can see how long they're not, how much time they're not initiating traffic. Maybe they opened up their session, went for a walk, went to the park or something like that. Gives you the interaction percentage and the maximum amount of time that they were inactive and in their session. So this really breaks down and tells you definitively whether or not a particular user was actually leveraging these tools while they said they were working from home. So with that, Stacy, I think I'll pass it back to you so we can wrap up.
Great. And just in case this is a question that typically comes in, which is, well, how long would it take to implement Goliath? We offer turnkey implementation services that can get you up and running in less than 2 hours. This includes our white glove implementation to install and get up and running. Also includes working with our technical consultants to get the top out-of-the-box reports, some of which you just saw, as well as alert functionality working in your environment. And then maybe most critical is we kind of kicked off this initiative in this webinar today. I spoke about the embedded intelligence and automation. This is natively in the product and really allows you then to identify exactly where root cause is and go ahead and address that immediately, as well as anticipate in the future so that you don't have to be an expert around these channels, around the protocols, and you can still solve the issues. So with that, let's go ahead and let's kick off some questions here. We've got a few that have come in. Please do continue others. So one of the questions that came in is, can your product identify if poorly managed GPOs are causing slow logon issues?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's another sort of differentiating factor between Goliath and some of the other tools that might be out there. Is our sort of the detail that we get within the logon process for a user session. So we can break down exactly each group policy that went into the session, down to the policy name and how long each one is taking to execute inside of the session. So you can effectively collapse the troubleshooting time frame and find exactly what's impacting the session. I can actually pull up the technology to take a closer to show you that. So here in one of the sessions that I opened previously, I can see there's a dedicated logon tab. So if I click now on logon summary, it takes me to this page where it breaks down what's happening during the brokering stages at the delivery controller, what's happening at Citrix receiver. And mind you, this is without deploying any technology to the user's endpoint machine. We're able to see things like how long ICA file download took, or how long it took to establish the micro VPN connection, how long it took for the overall session startup time at Citrix receiver. And particularly when it comes to group policies, we have a section here that expands, and again, it shows you each policy down to the policy name and how long it affects, how long each one took to execute inside of the user session. So if there is a problem with group policies, our technology will be able to pinpoint which exact group policies or number of policies that are impacting the environment negatively. Hopefully that is able to answer the question.
Great. Next question, Yemi, is what is producing the reports you showed and where does the service sit? So
the reports are actually being generated from our Goliath console, which is, it's typically deployed in the company data center. So these reports are you can be created and managed by you in your own environment. There's no, it doesn't have to send any information to any cloud services or anything like that. So you have all of these reports available to you on demand or in a on a scheduled basis as well.
Wonderful. Next one is, with our increased remote workers, we're seeing our infrastructure strained. Can you show a broader level to identify if it's a server or host maxing out a CPU power or memory causing issues?
Absolutely, yeah. And when we talk about our the technology, there is an element of embedded intelligence and automation. That's really apparent, and I can pull up a view here that might give you some additional information. This is our automatic discovery and dependency map view. And what this view does is it automatically is going to discover all of the components that deliver Citrix in your environment. It's then going to map them out and then add over 300 monitoring rules to the environment. It's going to be monitoring for conditions, failure points, thresholds, and events that actually can cause end user experience issues. So here you're able to see in this infrastructure of physical view, all of the infrastructure components that impact Citrix. So if you had NetScalers, they would show up here on the left-hand side of the screen. Here you can see the storefront servers, delivery controllers, or any supporting servers in the environment, like PVS, licensing servers, domain controllers, things of that nature. And you can click on them, and you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, resource utilization, any context-specific health checks, and any alerts that are firing off on these components. And as alerts fire off on these components, they start to turn orange or red, so you can quickly identify, okay, what's actually having a problem and how can I drill into it? Now, to answer the question specifically about the infrastructure, I can click here on the delivery layer. I can see all of my delivery groups. I can click down on a delivery group, and now I have a machine layer for this delivery group, where on the right-hand side of the screen, it's tying back user experience to the layer itself. So here we're looking at the delivery group. You can see resource utilization for delivery group on an average logon duration, average latency and network latency metrics, even the average connection speed that users have to access the environment. And this follows the line back down to the machine catalog. We're able to see more VM resources and things like that, down to the hypervisor cluster, even to the hypervisor host itself. So you're able to see if there is a hypervisor host that is supporting a particular delivery group that has maybe storage latency issues that are driving or bottlenecking ICA latency or ICA round trip time performance. So this is heavily used as a knock view because of its ability to tell you in real time what's impacting the session negatively, but it's also used as a troubleshooting stop because it's again able to tie back user experience to the Citrix infrastructure components that actually drive performance. So hopefully I was able to give some insight for that question.
Great. Next question that came in is, are you able to integrate with third parties like a ServiceNow or Splunk?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's how a number of our customers leverage our reporting and learning capabilities and things like that. They just integrate using a number of different ways into any third-party tools, ServiceNow, Splunk, and any other sort of aggregating tools like that.
All right, and I have one more question, so unless anyone else has anything, this could be the last one before we wrap up. It's, how is Goliath different from Citrix Director?
That's a good question. I know we always get that a lot, so we typically are prepared for those with slideware. So let me actually flip over to this slide. And so when we're talking about the difference between Goliath and a tool like Goliath and Citrix Director, it really comes down to visibility. So if you look here in the middle in the slide, these components that aren't in red, and we got this slide directly from Citrix's website, the components that aren't in red are what Director is going to monitor. Director does a good job of monitoring these because it's really built to be a tool that's going to defend Citrix itself, right? Making sure, okay, it's saying Citrix is not the root cause. However, there are a number of different things that impact the ability to not only deliver Citrix, but to have good sessions via Citrix. There's a lot of things that impact that are outside of that Citrix stack. So you have the users' endpoints, you have availability of the applications, the hypervisor platforms, the back-end systems, storage, and things like that. In a healthcare environment, you're talking about the applications, the EHR applications themselves. So the difference there is that Goliath is able to monitor everything you see here on the screen from one central console and tightly align everything to the time frame of sessions. So you as an IT administrator or someone that has to troubleshoot has everything you need with deep visibility to be able to come up with answers as to what's causing a problem or something like that. So hopefully that's able to give you an answer for that question.
Great. Well, I think that wraps up our webinar today. I did want to say that Doug Brown profusely apologizes for the internet issues he's had and was unable to join during the session. I got a few emails from him hoping his internet would come back. It did not. But with that, we really are proud to be partnering with iGel and together delivering a secure workspace in this digital future that allows you to easily monitor, troubleshoot, and report on that end user experience. So if you have additional questions or if you're interested in a free trial, please go ahead and email techinfo@goliathtechnologies.com. And as you close out the webinar today, you will be presented with a short survey. It will take less than a minute to complete. Please give us your feedback. Our goal is to ensure that we're continually providing useful and helpful content to the end user computing community, and we take that feedback seriously as we work through our webinar series. Thank you, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.